All right, today on Trials and Tribulations, we're talking about the most underrated tool in every employer's toolbox, documentation. Today, I've got expert Kristyn Berger, president of Berger HR Solutions, joining us to unpack what makes documentation defensible and why generic write-ups don't hold water in court, and how to create a paper trail that actually protects your business. So, Kristen, welcome. Uh, the first question I have is tell us, what does Berger HR Solutions do?
Sure. So we provide outsourced human resources support to small and mid-sized businesses that traditionally might not have an internal HR person. So teams that either don't have an HR person on their team at all, or maybe have someone but a less experienced HR professional and want my team to come in to guide, support, and mentor that person. And the backstory on that is I've been in HR for almost 20 years.
Yeah.
And half of that was spent in corporate America and in corporate internal HR job. And I realized actually talking to business bankers, employment attorneys like yourself, that so many small and mid-sized business owners, much to my shock, didn't have HR support.
Yeah.
And, and those often are the people who do run into issues because you don't have an HR person, you don't necessarily think about documentation or L.L.C rules on payroll or, and I had an aha moment while I was still internal that, I was in the banking industry. So everything we did was very buttoned up and thought through. And I thought, what a shame. But there's small and mid-sized business owners out there that are trying to do the best they can. And are falling short just because they don't have the knowledge and the expertise that they need to be an expert. And so that's really Berger HR Solutions was born out of that. And that's really what we do is we're there to support business owners, their directors of operations, office managers, whoever is really running their people function, and do it in a way that gives them confidence and helps them create a really positive workplace.
That's great. And do you work with clients all across the country, or is it specific geographic location?
We do. So we have a pretty big concentration in Baltimore, D.C., Virginia, but over the years, and especially post-pandemic, we help clients in California, Illinois, Texas, I mean, you name it.
Yeah.
And certainly we also have a lot of employers that are based here in a DMV that have employees in other states.
Yeah.
And so that actually, as we talk about documentation, the important thing about that is I know as an employment attorney, different states have different rules. And so, documentation, you have to be a little bit more thoughtful about what are the rules in the state this employee works in, and make sure we keep those in mind too if we're documenting.
Yeah. And also, if you've got employees crossing the various jurisdictions,
Yeah.
right? I mean, you've got to be mindful as well there. But that's great. If you're a small business owner, and every day you're thinking about the next client, the next sort of step in your development of your business. When should that business owner think about when they need an HR consultant to their business? Like, is that K1 or is that maybe employee number 5, 6, 7? When should they think about that?
So what I would say is smaller teams.
Yeah.
HR still wearing it.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like, even if you don't have an HR person, it doesn't mean you don't have an HR function. Just because, if you're a 4 or 5 person team, you're still recruiting new employees, you're onboarding new employees, you're providing them payroll and benefits, you're providing them training and development, coaching them in their roles, so whether you have HR or not, like you're engaging in HR type processes. So what I usually suggest to prospects when I talk to them is smaller teams sometimes can get away without having fully engaging with a team on HR.
Yeah.
But you should have an HR contact for an employment lawyer contact that you can reach out to check things, to ask compliance questions, to make sure your processes are solid. So, we'll work with smaller teams, but it's usually more on things like helping them set up a handbook.
Yeah.
Helping them figure out their recruiting and onboarding processes, making sure that they have a good process in place.
Yeah.
I'd say that by the time people get to 10, 15, 20 employees, you usually do mean at least a fractional HR person. And the reason for that is one, it's a numbers game. So once you get to 10, 15, 20 employees, there's a lot more happening within the HR function. I also, as a small business owner myself, know usually your first couple hires are people you know and trust. It's people who make you work with at a prior employer, or it's a family member or friend. Where I find once people get to that 10, 15, 20, they're usually hiring people that they may have no prior experience with. And so there's not that same level of trust, not even from like you trusting the employee, but the employee trusting you. You feel like your first couple hires might be fine with you saying, handshake deal, I'm going to give you 4 weeks of PTO and you're my friend and you're like, Kristen, I trust you. I know you're going to give me that time. Right. That 15th employee might want something a little bit more than an handshake deal. And so, I find just to create the best, most buttoned up employee experience, not just a legal experience, but like an engaging experience.
Yeah.
It's good at that once you start getting those bigger numbers to make sure you're engaging with one. And I do recommend, it's why I love working with employment attorneys like yourself, because I do think it's important to have an HR contact and an employment contact, because as we know, we have different specialties and we look at things from slightly different angles.
Absolutely. Tell us, why is documentation so often neglected, even by experienced managers and HR professionals?
So I think there's a couple of reasons
why documentation is neglected.
The first is honestly knowledge and competence. I think even experienced HR professionals and business owners sometimes aren't all that confident around what to document, when to document, what formats to put it in. And because they're not confident, they just don't do it.
Yeah.
I think another is time. So I know we're both business owners. I mean, yes, you're an employment attorney, I'm an HR professional, but we're business owners. And I think when it comes to time, I'm very limited.
Yeah.
And so sometimes, I've done it myself where I'll see something and think I should document this, but I'm off to the next meeting or the next call and it's a week later. And then, either I don't get to it, or quite honestly, if you put it off, it's harder because it's easy to document things in the moment. It's harder if it's a week from then, a month from then, and you're trying to remember what it is that you need to document. And then I'd say the third thing that I see, honestly, is fear. Fear of conflicts, not wanting to document because I think that feels more real and serious. Like, we might be going down a performance management path. And so I think sometimes, managers are like, I don't want to go down that path with this person. It's up to snuff and in bunking, and that's something I see with HR professionals. We have a lot of lawyer clients and lawyers who deal with conflict every day and can still be conflict averse. But when it's your own people, it's your employees, it's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard. So I think that we see, but there was those several reasons. There's a lot of people that know they should document, but they just don't.
Yeah. So let's talk about what good documentation action looks like. Yeah, from an HR perspective. What do you want to see? And let me paint a picture. You have a small business, client, and they've got an employee with performance or conduct related issues, and there's potential concern that down the road they may, allege some type of discrimination or something back at them. What if you're working with a client? What do you want good documentation to look like for purposes of, just being ready in case that employee decides that they, initiate a clash?
Sure. So what I physically want to see is a consistent paper trail. So from the start of the problems, not 2 months into there being the problem. Even if I think sometimes people think of documentation as a performance improvement plan or official write-up, but sometimes it's emails that were sent to the employee reminding them they're falling short of expectations, and a regular, consistent follow-up with communication, and maybe in different formats. It could be emails, it could be written documentation, it could be a performance information. So we look for that.
As far as the writing itself, the biggest things I look for are one, and this isn't just for legal purposes, but also, for from the perspective of an employee, I think it's really important that what is written is very objective.
Yes.
And doesn't have a lot of, feeling, or, I mean, you have to keep in mind, yes, these things could be read out loud in a court of law in your situation, and you want to make sure it's professional, but also you don't want to do that. So, like, an example of what I'll see sometimes is, you know, this employee is lazy and has disregard for time. Well, that's more of an opinion.
Yes.
Whereas having what you really want to document is, King has been late
Yes.
5 times this week, and here are the time breakdowns. Stick to the facts. You don't need to put your opinion that, this person is lazy or has a disregard for their roles or has been, has a poor attitude. Like, for example, I'll see this employee has had a poor attitude. Well, what's his poor attitude like? So, instead, to be more factual, I requested that this employee do XYZ, and they refused. Or for, said these other team members to let them know that they were displeased that they had to complete business. That goes a lot further, not just in the court of law, but with the employees. It's a lot easier if someone just said to me, Kristen, you're lazy. I'm going to say, well, I don't agree with that. I disagree. And it feels like you're personally attacking me.
Yes.
Where if you say to me, Kristen, you showed up late, 30 minutes late every day this week, and you have failed to meet your deadlines, like, one, it feels less personal. And two, there's less communication.
Yeah. Okay. And one thing let's also talk about too is, you have that formal documentation. Let's also talk about the text messages and Teams chats where you have situations where, for instance, you get in litigation, and yes, the former employee L.L.C is going to request HR documents, but they also want the emails and the text messages that were transmitted talking about him. What do you, in terms of when you're working with your clients, what do you kind of tell them about those sort of other means of communication and what have you as it relates to making sure that they don't create problematic communications?
So one of the things I communicate consistently to clients, especially clients that are dealing with a difficult employee, is do not put anything in writing. It's you would not want your attorney to read and the judge to read, other employees within your business to read, your mother to read. Basically don't put anything in writing that you would not want to be publicly out there. And I do give them that reminder of, yes, like, I think many business owners know if they get into litigation that, emails might be collected, that performance improvement documents are going to be collected, performance evaluations. What they don't think about, to your point, is text messages, Slack conversation, conversations that they have had with employees and aren't in management, that those individuals could be witnesses to say, well, this manager says he didn't happen out for this employee, but this is what he was saying to me behind the scenes. So I think it's very important that we hold ourselves to the highest standard as managers. And even if you're dealing with a really frustrating employee, because I've seen frustrating employees that I can understand why a manager would be frustrated or what events. Don't vent in writing. Don't vent to the wrong people. I always tell clients, if you need to vent and get something off your chest about an employee, call your attorney, call me, get it off your chest, but stay professional.
Yeah.
Like,
All the time, even at first. In terms of, documentation, had you seen a case where documentation has actually saved a company from, from a big lawsuit or, what have you seen in terms of how documentation can sort of change the dynamic in a particular case?
Sure. So, I mean, I'm sure you probably see that even more than me. Good documentation really helps an attorney. It's like, it doesn't matter how good of an attorney you are, you're a great attorney. If you don't have great documents and you don't have good facts, it's an uphill battle. So, I've seen situations, one that I've really seen save employers is having good pay records. That's the other thing outside of just performance evaluations in employment is it's really, really important that you have good timesheets, good records of work. So, for example, if you have an employee that says, I should have been paid overtime and wasn't, that you have clean records. I've seen that see many an employer. So that's important. But I've also seen, employees say, well, I feel as though I was discriminated against because of my gender, for example. But then there's a clear document trail showing, well, Kristen, you actually were late every day. You weren't meeting your deliverables. And so then, it's much more obvious it didn't necessarily involve my gender, that it was much more because of my conduct.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. We work with small and mid-sized companies. And for a lot of them, they got one other and maybe a few employees. And, oftentimes, we'll get brought in and, but former employees aren't sued or anything. One of the things we always hear from the owners, look, I don't have time to do this. Like, I'm just trying to find the next customer or the work the clients I have. What tips do you have for that small business and knows that they're going to have an attention problem? What tip do you have for them to just like, hey, to do these few things, it can go a long way in your attention. What do you have for them to release in terms of maybe create docu-teach?
Absolutely. So a couple things. One is doing it in the moment saves you time in the long run.
Yeah.
Because, writing things down while it's fresh in your mind, it's easier to document. It can be quick. Whereas, again, not have people try to piece things together a month after an event. And it's more time instilling than it can just do it if we know it ends. The interesting thing about that is reputationally, too. But, you have an employee who is late one day and you talk to them and you document it same day. They get the message. They know they were late that day. It's clear. Where if you wait a month because you've been busy, they feel like, well, why didn't you talk to me about this a month ago? I don't even remember being late. So I find, doing it in the moment helps reputationally, but also from a time perspective. There's nothing worse than getting into litigation and then trying to piece things together. It's costly from a time perspective of trying to piece everything together, but honestly, they're probably not going to get the same result as though, showing you've been a diligent business owner, manager, and been out with it. The other thing I tell clients is don't overcomplicate it. I think sometimes people think every document has to be a one-page breaking report, where sometimes like with the attendance, it might just be a simple, you're the employee. I pull you into my office and say, hey, Jay, you're an hour late today, and then I just send you a quick follow-up email of like, hey, as we discussed, you delayed several times the last week or two, like our shift starts at 9. Let's be mindful of our high. And so then it's quick. It doesn't feel as confrontational to you as the employee, and you're going to have that documentation. Because the other thing I see, and I'm sure you see it too, is managers who didn't document in the early stages. Because they were like, I never thought this was going to turn into SEO. Like, yes, I saw her performance start to dwindle, but I never thought it would get to a point where I would need to turn mean. And so as a result, they had conversations, they did the right things, but they didn't document it until it got worse, And then it looks like you just started coaching this person out of the blue when you've actually been coaching them for months. So it's like, I always say, like, get credit for your work. If you're coaching your employee, make sure that you're
getting the credit. You have the documentation that you can show, no, I really have been coaching and working with this employee. This isn't something it just came out.
Yeah, I know like that. And yeah, another thing I'll add is to be consistent in your performance. Like if was employee number one is late and you're doing coaching with that employee, and employee number three, even though they've been at these for 15 years or whatever, if they're late, they need to be coached as well to show that consistency.
100%. That's something we coach clients on a regular basis, and where we can be helpful as HR professionals, internal HR professionals as well, just say, look, we have to be consistent.
Yeah.
If we're going to do it for one, we have to do it for all.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'll even have those conversations. Sometimes a client will call and say, I want to hold someone accountable for this. And I'll say, like, business owner, I know you have 2 or 3 other members of your team that you have a really close relationship with that do the same thing, and you've never had the conversation with them. And if you only do it with this one employee, you're opening yourself up to claims of discrimination, favoritism, hostile work environment, where if you treat everyone equally, it's way less likely that someone's going to make that late.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. We talked a little bit about performance reviews. I want to touch on it a little more.
Mm-hmm.
Red flags in your performance reviews or write-ups that you see over and over. What do you see?
Oh, there's so many.
Yeah.
One that I see that is always a real kicker is when
An employer comes to me and says, hey, this person's underperforming. We really need your help coaching this person up or out. We think it's probably going to lead to a termination. And obviously, my first question as an HR professional is always, well, let me take a look at what you have.
Yeah.
Like, let me see their last performance evaluation. Let me see any, and you'd be amazed how many times someone will say, this person's underperforming. And then they give you the performance evaluation, and the manager's given them, it consistently achieves expectation. And gives them a very glowing review. And I'm like, okay, this review was written 3 months ago. And, you wrote, like, if I were to read this as an outsider, I would assume this person's a top performer.
Yep.
And now you're telling me that they're underperforming, which is true. It's like, were you not fully forthcoming in the performance evaluation, or did they tank in 3 months? This is a big disconnect. And it's not even just from a legal perspective. It's also for an employee. Like, if I'm an employee and I've received a consistently exceeds expectations review, and 3 months later, my manager is coaching me and telling me I'm not performing, that's going to be a big shock to me. Because again, it's that, which is, am I performing or am I not? And so that's one of the biggest ones we see. Some of the other things we see are performance evaluations that are very boilerplate, that are so generic that it really could be feedback given to any employee. And so there's really no meat behind it. And it's hard to really say based on it if the person's performing or not. Other things we see in performance evaluations is sometimes I like to call it the halo or horns effect. So there's performance appraisals where everything is very positive.
Yeah.
And as an HR professional, I'm like, we all have areas of development. Yeah, I have areas of development. If someone gave me a perfect review, you're like, I know I have areas of improvement or areas of development or areas where I can continue to grow and develop. So, an overly fluffy review concerns me. I also get concerned with reviews that are completely negative.
Yeah.
Because even people who are underperforming usually do have aspects of their job that they're good at. And so it's being honest and being balanced, because I can see where if someone receives an all negative review, they think my managed staff should me. He didn't see the projects that I completed or the good relationships that I have with coworkers. All we saw was negative.
You can say it's hard. How do you train managers to document properly? What do you do?
So me actually do training Okay. On performance management to our management groups, because I find, again, it's an area where a lot of managers have uncertainty. The other reason why we do training with groups of editors is because it's important in an organization that all of the managers document in a similar way. So, and they're consistent because, we talked about consistency, and it's easy if, you're a small business where you're the only one writing performance evaluations. It's easier to be consistent. Where I have seen groups of managers where one manager is very lax, gives people really good performance reviews, hardly ever holds people accountable and rates them up. And another manager is honest in performance reviews and holds people accountable and writes people up. That creates issues. As people in different departments talk, and they can say, well, my manager's after me. Where it's like, no, actually, if your manager is doing his or her job, when the manager of this other department isn't holding people accountable. And so those people who don't hold anyone accountable really make things hard. So, one, we do training for that consistency. But then also to teach managers that, there's not a one size. It's not like a performance evaluation or a performance improvement plan is the only documentation you should have in your toolbox. So it's the follow-up emails that you write employees after one-on-one. So it's even the behind-the-scenes document. Like I tell managers, you want to make sure you're presenting the data and having conversations with employees, but also keeping your own records and, writing down when you've had different conversations and your observations. And so, I think it's important the managers know there's many different ways to document, and the most important things that you have consistent documentation and that you have really a library that's not just like one document that you're holding on to and saying this performance improvement plan is my piece.
Yeah.
That you have a stream and a timeline about it.
Awesome. Kristen, thank you so much. And before we conclude today, let me ask you this. What's your final takeaway to the small and mid-sized business owner? What seem takeaways that they should have from our discussion today?
So I think documentation is important.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things to stress is, yes, documentation is important from a legal perspective. Should you find yourself in litigation or defending an unemployment claim, that documentation is going to go a long way in helping you and your attorney fill a strong case. I think the other thing, though, is that it's really not just for legal purposes. From my perspective as an HR professional, it's just good management, leadership practice. And you should want to make sure that your employee receives the coaching and feedback that they need. So a lot of times I think people think of performance management documentation is like a negative thing for employees. I would actually argue that done the right way, done proactively, done professionally, done in a way that is seen as, truly coaching and helping the employee is really what the focus should be in documentation. Because in my mind, the worst thing that can happen as an employment professional is that an employee gets terminated and it's shocked. That they, like, I didn't see this coming. I had no idea. I wish I would have received coaching and feedback. I've even heard people say, like, had I known this is a problem, I might have fixed it. And so I think, I always say as important as coaching out, it's coaching up. And if you, whether you coach up or coach out, it looks the same. It's having frequent conversations, providing very proactive and constructive professional feedback, and then it's really up to the employee.
Right.
They either take that coaching and feedback and are coached up and end up being a solid to a star performer, which I think is what all of us want.
Yeah.
Or they are coached out, but it's essentially been their choice because they know what the issues are and either unable or unwilling to make new improvements. And so it's not a shock when they're terminated. And I also find there's less animosity. If someone's shocked when they're terminated, it comes to conflict, and I'm sure you've seen those employees
Whereas I find if someone's like, you know what, no, my manager talked to me, they provided me coaching and feedback, they gave me 3 months, 6 months, they gave me resources, they sent me to training, they had me work with other employees. They might not be happy that they were terminated. Right. But they respect their manager and know, you know what, my manager gave me the opportunity and either didn't have the skill set, this just isn't the right job for me.
Yeah.
Or like I decided this isn't the right job for me. And I mean, I've even had people that have been terminated and been thankful because I think, you know, if you do it right, employees realize after several months of coaching, maybe this just isn't it's not the right job for me. It's not the right office for me. And, you know, ideally, I've even seen situations where it's through the coaching process, employees had moved to other jobs.
Yeah.
Because they see the writing on the wall. They know that they're not going to improve their performance for whatever reason. And they're like, you know what? I need to go to a job where I can be successful. And then they get to resign.
Yeah.
And as an employer, you know, it feels much better than having to terminate someone or certainly end up in litigation.
Yeah, exactly. And like, you know, to elaborate on what you're saying as well, it also sets clear, it allows the other employees to see we have an employer, it's clear expectations. Everybody kind of knows what's expected of them in a performance culture.
Absolutely. Because like I always say when you're performance managing one employee, you know, you're really performance managing and creating accountability for your whole team. Because what I see all too often is one employee is allowed to be consistently late, underperform, miss deadlines, had corner actions with clients, and whether we as business owners realize it or not, all of the other employees are seeing that behavior too. And nothing ever happened, and that behavior is allowed to continue, and that person continues on the team. Typically, what I see as an HR professional is other employees starting to follow suit.
Yeah.
So it's like, well, Jean's late every day by half an hour. So if I show up 5 minutes late,
Will be the deal.
right. And so I think it's what's fair for employees, not just the employee that you're performance managing, but for other employees too. Like it's our job as leaders to set clear expectations and then be fair and consistent in how we uphold those expectations. And that earns you, again, that doesn't just protect you from a legal perspective, and it does, but it helps build trust. It helps employees see you as a strong leader who does provide clear expectations, and there's no surprises, which I think is what none of us want surprises in the workplace.
No, you do not.
So it's, you know, much as we can eliminate those surprises and the better and more positive culture we'll have.
Right. Kristen, thank you so much for your time today. Really enjoyed it. Love to have you back. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Jay.
Thank you.